The German infantry appeared through the trees just after sunrise, moving in long scattered lines across the slope below the American position. From a distance, it almost looked like a training march, but the soldiers climbing the hill carried rifles ready, and machine gun teams moved behind them with practiced coordination. The American platoon holding the ridge had already been fighting for hours, and their numbers were thinning fast. Ammunition was running low, communication lines were broken, and the German advance below them showed no signs of slowing. Private Thomas Keller lay behind a low line of sandbags, with his hands wrapped around the grips of a Browning machine gun, the long belt of ammunition feeding through the receiver beside him. The weapon had been positioned at the center of the ridge because it controlled the narrow valley road that ran directly up toward the American position. If the Germans reached the crest, and they would break through the line and roll straight into the rear of the defending forces. Keller watched the advancing soldiers carefully through the iron sights of the machine gun. The enemy infantry were spreading out now, moving from tree to tree while officers behind them shouted short commands that carried through the morning air. A few German soldiers began setting up their own machine gun positions further down the hill, preparing to suppress the American ridge before the main assault began. The American riflemen around Keller checked their magazines quietly while waiting for the order to fire. Everyone on the ridge understood what was coming next. Once the Germans closed the distance, the fight would turn into a direct charge uphill. Keller pulled the charging handle of the Browning machine gun and felt the weapon lock forward. With a heavy metallic click, the German line began moving faster, and suddenly the entire hillside started running toward the ridge. The moment the German soldiers broke into a run, Keller pressed the trigger, and the Browning machine gun roared across the ridge. The weapon kicked heavily against the sandbags as a stream of .30 caliber rounds tore down the slope toward the advancing infantry. Tracer bullets cut bright lines through the morning air, while the first group of German soldiers was caught completely exposed in the open ground between the trees. Several of them dropped instantly, while others threw themselves flat against the hillside to escape the deadly line of fire. The sudden burst from the machine gun shattered the momentum of the charge before it had even reached the halfway point of the hill. German officers shouted new orders and waved their men forward again. But now every soldier on the slope understood exactly where the American gun was positioned. The German machine gun team that had been setting up lower on the hill quickly turned their weapon toward the ridge and opened fire in return. Bullets snapped across the sandbags and tore into the dirt around Keller's position, while splinters from shattered branches rained down from the trees above them. The German gunners were trying to pin the American machine gun in place so the infantry could continue advancing. Keller ducked briefly as a burst struck the sandbags in front of him, then leaned back into the weapon and fired again. The Browning thundered across the valley, sending another long burst of bullets into the slope where German soldiers were attempting to regroup. Several men who had begun rising from cover dropped back to the ground immediately as the heavy fire swept across their line. The charge that had begun seconds earlier with confident speed was now slowing under the relentless fire of the machine gun. German soldiers tried to crawl forward, using rocks and trees for cover, but every time they moved into open ground, the Browning opened up again. The hill had turned into a deadly funnel, and Keller's machine gun was sitting directly at the top of it. The German officers refused to stop the assault. Even with men pinned down on the slope, new groups of soldiers continued pushing forward from the tree line below, spreading out across the hillside in an attempt to overwhelm the American position with sheer numbers. Keller saw them appearing between the trees, moving quickly from cover to cover as they tried to close the distance before the machine gun could cut them down again. And the Browning's barrel smoked slightly as he shifted the weapon left and right, tracking the movement of the advancing infantry. Every burst had to be controlled carefully because the ammunition belt feeding into the gun was already running shorter than he liked. The German machine gun below the ridge increased its fire, sending long bursts toward the sandbags, while another team began dragging a light mortar into position behind a fallen tree. The mortar crew worked quickly on setting the tube into the dirt, while an officer beside them pointed toward the American machine gun nest on the ridge above. If the mortar started firing accurately, Keller's position would become impossible to hold. He saw the crew preparing their first round and immediately swung the Browning toward them. The machine gun roared again, its heavy rhythm echoing across the hillside as the burst tore through the area around the mortar team. But dirt exploded upward as bullets struck the ground beside them, and the crew scattered before the weapon could even be fired. Keller shifted the gun again toward another group of German soldiers who had begun sprinting up the slope on the far side of the hill. They had tried to use the distraction of the mortar team to advance unseen, but the open ground betrayed them. The Browning opened fire once more, forcing the attackers to dive behind rocks before they could reach the halfway point of the hill. What had begun as a confident German charge was turning into a brutal uphill struggle against a single machine gun holding the ridge. Realizing the direct charge up the valley road was failing, the German officers began shifting their strategy. Instead of sending more men straight toward the machine gun, they started pushing soldiers along both sides of the hill, using thicker patches of trees to approach the American position from the flanks. Keller noticed the movement almost immediately. Dark figures slipped between the trunks of the trees to the left side of the ridge, trying to climb higher without exposing themselves to the machine gun's direct line of fire. If they managed to reach the crest from the side, the machine gun nest could be surrounded within minutes. Keller swung the Browning toward the left flank and fired a short burst through the trees. Branches exploded as the bullets ripped through the forest edge, forcing the advancing soldiers to drop flat behind logs and rocks. The gun could not see them clearly through the thick cover, but the sheer volume of fire kept them from moving any closer to the ridge. Meanwhile, the riflemen positioned beside Keller began firing their own shots toward the right side of the hill, where another group of German soldiers was attempting the same flanking maneuver. The German machine gun below the ridge opened up again, spraying long bursts toward the American position, while the infantry on the slope tried to use the distraction to advance once more. Keller ignored the incoming fire and returned the Browning toward the center of the hill, where several German soldiers had begun rushing forward again in a desperate attempt to break through. The heavy machine gun hammered the ground in front of them, sending dirt and stones flying as the attackers dove for cover once more. The Germans were now attacking from three directions, but every path up the hill still crossed the same deadly stream of machine gun fire. The battle had turned into a grinding fight of movement and suppression across the hillside. German soldiers continued trying to push closer, using every patch of cover available, while Keller kept the Browning machine gun sweeping across the slope to stop them from reaching the ridge. The weapon had already fired hundreds of rounds, and the long ammunition belt beside him was growing noticeably shorter. Every burst had to be used carefully now, but because if the gun fell silent, the German infantry would surge forward all at once. A sudden burst from the German machine gun struck the sandbags directly in front of Keller, sending a cloud of dirt and fabric into the air. One of the American riflemen beside him ducked down as bullets snapped overhead, then returned fire toward the enemy gun position further down the hill. Keller waited for the burst to stop before leaning back into the Browning and firing again. The machine gun roared across the valley, forcing the German gunners to abandon their position and crawl back behind the rocks they had been using as cover. The hillside below the ridge was now scattered with the German soldiers pinned behind trees and stones, while others continued searching for a path that would take them safely closer to the crest. But the terrain itself worked against them. The narrow valley forced the attackers to cross open ground sooner or later, and every time they did, the American machine gun opened up again. The Browning had turned the entire slope into a killing zone that the German charge could not cross without heavy losses. For the soldiers on the ridge, it had become clear what was holding the line. The German officers tried one final push before abandoning the assault. Fresh soldiers moved forward from the tree line below and began running uphill together, spreading out across the slope in a desperate attempt to overwhelm the American defense by sheer numbers. Keller saw the movement instantly and pulled the trigger again. The Browning machine gun thundered across the ridge as the long burst swept through the advancing line of soldiers. Its tracer rounds cut across the hillside while several attackers dropped before reaching the halfway point of the hill. The men behind them hesitated as the deadly stream of bullets tore through the open ground. Some soldiers attempted to continue forward, ducking and weaving between rocks, but the machine gun tracked their movement relentlessly. The hillside echoed with the roar of the Browning as Keller shifted the weapon slightly and fired another burst into the center of the charge, and the attackers scattered once more, diving behind whatever cover they could find as the assault began to collapse. German officers shouted for their men to keep moving, but the momentum of the charge had already been broken. Too many soldiers were pinned down on the slope, and the few who managed to advance further were immediately forced back by the heavy fire from the ridge. What had begun as a coordinated attack was now dissolving into scattered groups of infantry, trying to retreat toward the tree line below. Within minutes, the hillside grew quieter as the surviving German soldiers pulled back into the forest. The assault that had threatened to overwhelm the ridge had been stopped before reaching the American line, and the gun that had held the hill was still smoking on the sandbags. The sudden quiet after the fighting felt almost unreal. Only minutes earlier, the hillside had been filled with shouting soldiers, roaring machine guns, and bullets snapping through the air. Now the slope below the ridge was mostly empty, except for scattered figures retreating toward the tree line in the distance. Keller kept the Browning pointed down the valley for several seconds longer, ready to fire again if the Germans attempted another charge. But the attack had clearly failed. Now the American riflemen along the ridge slowly lifted their heads from behind the sandbags and checked their ammunition. Several soldiers looked toward the machine gun, where Keller still sat behind the weapon, the barrel warm and faintly smoking from the long bursts of fire. Everyone on the ridge knew exactly why the German assault had stopped where it did. Without the machine gun controlling the valley road, the infantry charge might have reached the crest within minutes. An officer moved along the line of defenders, scanning the hillside carefully through binoculars before lowering them again. The German soldiers had fully withdrawn into the trees and were no longer attempting to advance. The ridge was safe for the moment. Keller finally released the grips of the Browning and leaned back slightly, letting the tension drain from his arms after holding the weapon steady for so long. The battle for the hill had lasted less than an hour, but the result was clear. A full German charge had been sent uphill expecting to break through the American line. Instead, it had been stopped halfway up the slope by a single machine gun controlling the narrow valley road. Sometimes a battle is decided by numbers or artillery. Sometimes it is decided by the weapon sitting at the top of the hill. Machine guns had become one of the most important weapons on the battlefield during World War II. Positioned correctly, a single gun could control large sections of terrain and prevent entire groups of soldiers from advancing. The Browning machine gun used by American forces was designed specifically for this kind of defensive role. Its steady rate of fire and reliable operation allowed a small number of soldiers to hold positions that would otherwise require far larger forces. At the hill Keller had defended was a perfect example of that principle. The narrow valley below forced any attacking force to move through the same open ground before reaching the ridge. That meant every soldier attempting to climb the slope eventually crossed the firing arc of the machine gun positioned at the top. As long as the Browning kept firing, the German infantry could not move forward without exposing themselves to heavy fire. The German commanders understood the power of machine guns as well, which is why they had tried to silence Keller's position with their own weapons and a mortar team earlier in the fight. If those weapons had managed to destroy the American gun nest, the assault might have continued. Instead, the machine gun remained active throughout the attack, cutting down every attempt to cross the open hillside. By the time the Germans finally withdrew into the trees, the ridge was still firmly in American hands. The defensive line had held not because of overwhelming numbers or heavy artillery, but because the right weapon had been placed in the right position at the right moment. And on that morning, that weapon was one American machine gun. The soldiers on the ridge continued watching the valley long after the German infantry disappeared back into the forest. Everyone understood that the quiet might only be temporary. Battles on the Western Front often shifted quickly, and another attack could come at any moment. But for now, the hillside below them remained empty, the earlier charge having collapsed before reaching the American line. Keller wiped the dust from his hands and checked the ammunition belt feeding through the Browning machine gun. Only a small section of the belt remained compared to the long chain of rounds he had started with earlier that morning. The weapon had fired continuously during the attack, stopping every attempt by the German soldiers to cross the open ground below the ridge. Across the hillside, the evidence of the fight was still visible. The valley road that had once looked like the perfect route for an assault was now scattered with abandoned equipment and disturbed earth where bullets had torn through the ground. The German charge that had begun with speed and confidence had been forced to turn back before reaching the crest. The American line held firm across the ridge as the sun climbed higher above the trees. The attack had ended as quickly as it had begun, stopped not by a large defensive force, but by the steady fire of a single weapon placed at the center of the position. One American machine gun had been enough to stop an entire German charge.